My name is Lucy. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, work has been the place where I believed character mattered more than performance. I've been described as steady, dependable, someone who listens more than she speaks, the kind of person managers trust with sensitive projects but rarely associate with ambition. People often assume I'm agreeable because I don't raise my voice, or harmless because I don't compete loudly. I've learned that when you're calm, people project simplicity onto you. They think they understand you fully, your limits, your patience, your role, without ever asking. This story isn't about revenge. It's not about winning. And it's not about exposing anyone publicly. It's about something quieter and more uncomfortable. What happens when trust is misplaced in a professional environment and how power actually shifts, not through confrontation, but through clarity. I trusted the wrong person at work, but that would make it sound like a single bad decision. The truth is more gradual. It's about small moments that don't register as betrayal until much later. It's about how they smiled in meetings and stabbed me later. Not dramatically, not obviously, but efficiently. For a long time, I believed that if I stayed consistent, fair, and ethical, things would resolve themselves. That silence was neutrality. That professionalism was protection. I didn't realize that silence is often interpreted as permission. What you're about to hear is a first-person account of how I went from being invisible to being unavoidable, without raising my voice, without humiliating anyone, and without breaking my own moral code. There are no villains here twirling mustaches, no explosive arguments, no sudden strokes of luck, just systems, people, and choices. This story moves slowly on purpose. It begins with how I was seen, or rather, not seen. It moves through the normalization of subtle disrespect. Then comes the shift, not an external event, but an internal one. From there, everything changes quietly, strategically, legally, ethically. If you're looking for drama, this may frustrate you. If you're looking for justice that doesn't require cruelty, you might recognize yourself in it. I'm sharing this because many people live through similar dynamics and assume they're alone, or weak, or imagining things. They're not. Sometimes the strongest move isn't to react. It's to observe, prepare, and choose the moment that aligns with who you want to be after it's all over. So before we begin, I want to ask you something gently. No judgment, just curiosity. Have you ever sensed that something at work wasn't right, even when everything looked fine on the surface? At work, I was known as someone solid, not brilliant, not bold, just solid. That word followed me for years, usually delivered as a compliment, sometimes as a dismissal. Solid meant reliable. It meant I didn't create problems. It meant things ran smoothly when I was involved, even if no one could quite explain how. I wasn't the loudest voice in meetings. I didn't interrupt. I didn't sell my ideas like they were miracles. I waited, I listened, I took notes. When decisions were made, I executed them cleanly. When something broke, I fixed it quietly before it escalated. People liked working with me because I reduced friction. I made their days easier. What I didn't realize, at least not at first, was that ease can become erasure. In meetings, people would summarize my points 5 minutes after I made them, as if they'd just thought of them. Sometimes they'd look around for confirmation, and I'd see heads nodding. No one looked at me. I told myself it didn't matter. The work was moving forward. That was the goal, right? When new hires joined, they were told I was the one who knows how things actually work. That sounded like respect, but it also meant I became the default for questions no one else wanted to answer. I was looped into everything and credited for very little. I had access without authority, responsibility without visibility. I didn't resent it. Not then. I thought this was the trade-off for stability. I'd grown up believing that if you kept your head down and did your job well, recognition would eventually find you. That fairness was slow, but reliable. People above me saw me as low risk. That was the phrase I heard once, unintentionally, when a manager didn't realize I was still on the call. Lucy's a safe pair of hands. Not someone you worry about losing, not someone you rush to promote, just safe. My peers saw me as agreeable, approachable, someone they could vent to without consequences. They shared frustrations with me that they'd never say out loud. They trusted me with their fears, their mistakes. I kept their confidence. I always did. What they didn't see was that I remembered everything, not in a bitter way, more like an internal archive. Who said what? Who took credit? Who stayed silent when it mattered? Who smiled warmly in meetings and became colder in private emails? Patterns don't announce themselves. They repeat quietly until you can't ignore them anymore. There was one colleague in particular, someone who was always pleasant, always supportive in public. They'd praise collaboration, talk about team wins. They'd ask for my input before meetings, nod thoughtfully, then present the conclusions as their own. At first, I assumed it was a coincidence. or miscommunication, or my own insecurity. I gave people the benefit of the doubt because I wanted to believe we were all operating in good faith. Looking back, I see how that belief shaped my role. I became useful but non-threatening, knowledgeable but deferential, someone whose absence would cause chaos, but whose presence was taken for granted. No one actively pushed me down. That's the uncomfortable part. There was no single antagonist, no dramatic slight I could point to and say, "That's when it started." Instead, there was a collective agreement, unspoken, gradual, about who I was allowed to be. I was allowed to support. I was allowed to fix. I was allowed to absorb. I was not expected to challenge, or claim, or step out of the space that had been quietly assigned to me. And because I didn't resist it, because I believed professionalism meant patience, that role solidified. This part of the story matters because it explains why what came later surprised everyone but me. From the outside, I looked unchanged, calm, consistent, predictable. Inside, something else was forming. Not anger, not ambition, but awareness. And once you truly see how you're being positioned, you can't unsee it. The first moment that stayed with me wasn't dramatic. That's what made it dangerous. It happened in a weekly planning meeting, one of those routine gatherings where nothing is supposed to change and therefore everything quietly does. I had spent the previous week untangling a workflow issue that had been slowing 3 departments down. It wasn't glamorous work, just cross-checking assumptions, tracing delays, documenting handoffs no one wanted to own. When I spoke, I kept it simple. I explained what I'd found. I outlined a solution that didn't require new tools or extra budget, just a small change in sequence. I wasn't trying to impress anyone. I just wanted the problem to stop repeating. There was a pause afterward, not uncomfortable, just neutral. Then the meeting moved on. 5 minutes later, someone else, someone with a more confident tone, someone who liked to summarize, reframed what I'd said, nearly word for word. They spoke as if the idea had occurred to them in that moment, their voice warming as they talked through it. "This might be a way to streamline things," they said. Heads nodded. Someone smiled. The manager leaned forward, interested. "That's a great idea," he said. "Let's explore that." No one looked at me. I felt something then. Not anger, not embarrassment, just a quiet disorientation, like realizing you'd spoken out loud but hadn't made a sound. I glanced down at my notes to make sure I hadn't imagined it. I told myself it was nothing. Meetings are messy, ideas overlap. Credit is rarely precise. I didn't want to be the kind of person who keeps score, so I stayed silent. Afterward, the colleague stopped by my desk. They smiled easily. "Good meeting," they said. "Thanks for your input earlier." I nodded. I smiled back. I said nothing. That was the cut. Small enough to ignore, clean enough to dismiss, but precise. What made it linger wasn't the loss of credit. It was the realization that this could happen so easily, that my contribution could be absorbed and represented without resistance, that my silence made it seamless. I watched closely after that, not suspiciously, just attentively. I noticed how often ideas traveled this way, how often I was consulted privately and excluded publicly, how feedback flowed upward without my name attached, how praise moved laterally and settled elsewhere. No one else seemed bothered. Or maybe they were, and they'd learned to live with it. The culture rewarded confidence, not accuracy, visibility, not depth. I told myself I was being sensitive, that this was the cost of collaboration, that my value wasn't tied to recognition. But something had shifted, not in how I acted. Externally, nothing changed, but in how I listened. I started noticing the language people used around me as "at least they will handle it." "Lucy's already across that." "Lucy doesn't mind." Those sentences were never said with malice. That was the problem. They were said with comfort, with an assumption. The colleague from the meeting continued to be friendly, supportive. In group settings, they praised teamwork. In private, they asked for my thoughts. I gave them carefully. Still generously, but with an internal note attached. Not a grudge, a record. The first small cut taught me something important. Disrespect doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it wears politeness. Sometimes it hides behind efficiency. Sometimes it's so normalized that pointing it out makes you look unreasonable. So I didn't point it out. I didn't confront. I didn't correct. I didn't reclaim the moment. Instead, I did what I'd always done. I observed. And in that observation, I began to understand the environment I was in. Not hostile, not overtly unfair, just quietly extractive. It was a place where contribution flowed upward and sideways, rarely back to the source, where those who spoke last were remembered more clearly than those who spoke first. That realization didn't harden me. It clarified me. And clarity, I would later learn, is far more disruptive than anger. Once you notice a pattern, you start seeing it everywhere. What had felt like an isolated moment slowly revealed itself as routine, ideas drifting away from their origin. Responsibilities are accumulating quietly on my desk. Decisions are being discussed around me instead of with me. None of it was overt. That was the part that made it easy to tolerate and easier for everyone else to ignore. The same colleague continued to ask for my thoughts before meetings. I'd receive a casual message, "Can I run something by you?" Or, "Would love your take on this before tomorrow." I answered honestly and thoroughly. I believed that collaboration meant sharing thinking, not guarding it. In meetings, those thoughts resurfaced, polished, condensed, delivered with confidence. I watched them land cleanly, accepted, without friction. I told myself it was fine, that I didn't need to be the face of every solution. That influence mattered more than visibility. That staying out of office politics was a strength, not a weakness. Silence became my default response, not because I was afraid, but because it felt reasonable. Each time something similar happened, I found an explanation that protected the peace. They probably didn't realize. It's not worth making it awkward. I don't want to seem territorial. This isn't personal. And maybe, individually, none of those moments were personal, but together they formed something else entirely. I began to notice how often I was described in functional terms, not as someone with insight or leadership, but as someone who sat things moving, someone who filled gaps, someone who was always there. That kind of language sounds appreciative until you realize it doesn't lead anywhere. It keeps you exactly where you are. When performance reviews came around, the feedback was consistent. I was praised for reliability, for institutional knowledge, for being a stabilizing presence. Then came the familiar phrase, "We'd like to see you be a bit more visible." Visible how, I wondered? Louder? More assertive? More comfortable taking space that no one seemed willing to make room for? I asked once gently, what would visibility look like in practice? The answer was vague. Just speak up more. Put yourself out there. As if I hadn't been speaking all along, just without claiming the spotlight. So I adjusted slightly. I spoke earlier in meetings. I restated my points more clearly. For a while it helped, then the pattern adapted. Someone else echoed me, or summarized, or reframed. The system was efficient. It didn't need to silence me, it just needed to redirect attention. What surprised me most was how quickly this dynamic became normal. Not just for them, but for me. I started anticipating being overlooked. I lowered my expectations. I stopped imagining certain outcomes. Not consciously, but gradually. Like furniture being moved a few inches at a time until the room feels smaller and you can't quite remember why. I didn't feel angry. I felt tired. There's a particular exhaustion that comes from being useful without being seen, from carrying weight that isn't acknowledged, and then being told you're not stepping up enough. Still, I stayed. I believed in the work. I liked my team. I trusted the process. I thought patience would pay off. And if I'm honest, part of me took pride in being indispensable, in knowing that things would unravel without my involvement. That knowledge felt like security. But indispensability without authority is a trap. You become necessary but replaceable, trusted but overlooked. The smiles continued, the friendliness, the collaborative language. On the surface, everything was fine, better than fine. Underneath, something was being quietly normalized. The idea that my role was to contribute without claiming, to support without leading, to absorb without acknowledgement. I told myself I could live with that not everyone needs to be visible to be valuable. What I didn't realize was that by normalizing the disrespect, I was also teaching people how to treat me. And once a behavior becomes normalized, it stops being questioned. It just becomes the way things are. The realization didn't arrive all at once. It settled in slowly, like a conclusion I'd been avoiding because it felt uncharitable. I had been assigned a role, not officially, not in any document or job description, but it was there, reinforced daily through expectation and omission. I was the one people relied on to make things work, quietly, efficiently, without complication. The problem solver behind the scenes, the person you go to when something is stuck, but not the person you elevate when it's moving. Once I saw it, I couldn't stop seeing it. When leadership discussed future initiatives, my name didn't come up, not because I lacked experience, but because I already had a function. I was the stabilizer. You don't move stabilizers, you lean on them. When timelines were tight, work flowed toward me. When credit was distributed, it flowed around to me. I wasn't excluded. I was simply assumed. I noticed how often decisions were made that affected my workload without my input. Not out of disregard, but out of confidence. Lucy will manage. Lucy won't push back. Lucy understands. And I did understand. That was the problem. I understood the pressure everyone was under, the incentives, the fear of rocking the boat. I understood how organizations reward those who make themselves visible, not necessarily those who make things function. So I accommodated, I adjusted, I absorbed. The colleague who had first reframed my ideas now occupied a clear space in the room. They were seen as strategic, vocal, leadership adjacent. I was seen as operational, dependable, supportive. Both roles were necessary. Only one was I began to realize that my consistency had made me predictable, and predictability in certain environments becomes a ceiling. No one expected me to challenge decisions publicly. No one worried I'd escalate issues. No one imagined I might step outside the role they'd grown comfortable with. That comfort was mutual at first. It allowed me to work without conflict, but it also allowed others to define my boundaries for me. There was a moment, small, unremarkable to anyone else, when this became unmistakable. A leadership meeting was scheduled to address a process I had built from the ground up. I wasn't invited. When I asked why, the answer was immediate and unthinking. We didn't think you'd want to sit through that. They weren't trying to exclude me. They genuinely believed they were sparing me. That's when it became clear. My role wasn't just assigned by others. It was maintained by my compliance. I wasn't invisible because I was overlooked. I was invisible because I was convenient that way. That realization didn't make me angry. It made me still. For the first time, I stopped asking how to be seen within the existing structure. I started asking a different question. What happens if I step out of it entirely? I didn't act on that thought yet. I wasn't ready, but the question lingered. I looked at my work differently. I noticed how much institutional knowledge lived only in my head or in my private notes. How many processes depended on my memory, my judgment, my discretion. How often was I the bridge between departments that didn't speak the same language? I had leverage. Not dramatic leverage, not the kind you threaten with, the quiet kind that comes from being at the center of how things actually function. I hadn't used it because I hadn't needed to, because I believed good faith was enough. Now I understand something crucial. Roles don't change because you deserve more. They change because the system is forced to adapt. I wasn't ready to force anything, not yet, but I stopped trying to fit the role I'd been given. And in that pause, between compliance and action, something began to shift internally. I was no longer asking for space. I was deciding when and whether to take it. The day everything shifted didn't look important from the outside. There was no argument, no raised voices, no dramatic email. It was an ordinary Tuesday, the kind that blends into every other week without leaving a mark. If you'd asked anyone else what happened that day, they wouldn't remember it at all. I remember it clearly. I was sitting in a conference room, listening to a presentation about a new operational framework. Slides moved steadily across the screen. Familiar language, familiar diagrams. My language, my diagrams. The framework had been introduced as a collaborative effort, a team-developed solution. My name appeared once, in small text, alongside several others. No distinction, no context. As the presenter spoke, I realized something that stopped me cold. Not emotionally, but cognitively. This wasn't an oversight. It was the natural outcome of everything that had come before. No one had taken anything from me. I had given it. Freely, repeatedly, without condition, without boundary. And in doing so, I had trained the system to function exactly as it was. That understanding landed quietly. No surge of anger, no urge to correct the record, just a clear, almost clinical awareness. I watched the room instead of the slides. I watched who leaned forward when certain points were made, who nodded, who looked bored. I watched how authority circulated, not through accuracy, but through confidence and positioning. For the first time, I wasn't participating. I was observing from a distance. I realized then that I had been confusing contribution with influence. They're not the same thing. Contribution keeps things moving. Influence decides where they move. I had spent years perfecting the first and assuming the second would follow. It hadn't. When the meeting ended, people gathered their things. There was casual praise. Great work, everyone. Someone patted the presenter on the shoulder. They smiled, gracious, already thinking about the next step. No one spoke to me. I didn't feel slighted. I felt finished. Not finished with the job. Finished with the illusion. I returned to my desk and opened my notebook, the one I'd kept for years. It wasn't a diary. It was a record. Processes, decisions, conversations, patterns. At the time, I told myself it was just how I stayed organized. Now I saw it differently. I didn't add anything that day. I didn't need to. I just flipped through the pages and saw the shape of my own involvement laid out in ink. The dependencies, the assumptions, the way my silence had smoothed everything over. That was the moment I stopped seeing myself as part of the background and started seeing myself as infrastructure. And infrastructure, when it shifts, changes everything above it. I didn't confront anyone. There was no point. Confrontation would have required them to acknowledge something they didn't even perceive as an issue. It would have made me emotional in a system that rewards composure. Instead, I made a decision, not an action, just a decision. I would stop offering unclaimed value, not out of spite, out of alignment. If I were going to contribute, it would be within structures that recognized contribution properly. If I were going to share insight, it would be in ways that couldn't be absorbed without acknowledgement. And if that wasn't possible, I would stop sharing. This wasn't withdrawal, it was recalibration. I finished the day as I always had, responded to emails, closed loops, helped where it asked. No one noticed anything different, but internally, something fundamental had changed. I no longer believed that staying quiet was neutral. I understood now that silence is a position, and I had been occupying it for far too long. That day didn't mark the beginning of action. It marked the end of waiting. After that day, my behavior didn't change in any obvious way. That was intentional. I still arrived on time. I still met deadlines. I still spoke politely in meetings. From the outside, I was exactly who I had always been. Steady, reliable, unremarkable. The difference was internal. Before, my silence had been reactive, a byproduct of courtesy, patience, and the desire to avoid conflict. Now it was deliberate, chosen, structured. I stopped filling in gaps that hadn't been assigned to me. When questions were vague, I asked for clarity instead of providing solutions. When ideas were half-formed, I let them remain that way unless I was explicitly invited to contribute, and credited accordingly. This wasn't passive aggression. It was precision. People didn't notice at first. They were used to my availability, used to my anticipatory help, used to smooth things over before problems reached the surface. So when I stopped doing that extra, invisible labor the assumption was that I was simply busy. That's okay, Lucy will catch it later. I didn't. In meetings, I spoke only when my role required it. No preemptive insights. No behind-the-scenes coaching. When someone asked for my thoughts privately, I asked them to include me in the official discussion. Happy to share. Let's put it on the agenda. That sentence did more than any confrontation ever could. Some people interpreted the shift as disengagement. Others experienced fatigue. A few saw it as a weakness, a loss of interest, maybe even confidence. The colleague who had often reframed my ideas seemed unaffected at first. They continued presenting, continued speaking with certainty. But without my input, their proposals began to show cracks, not dramatic failures, just small inconsistencies, overlooked dependencies, timelines that didn't quite hold. Nothing catastrophic, just enough friction to be noticed. I watched it happen without satisfaction. This wasn't about proving anything, it was about letting the system operate without my silent corrections. What surprised me was how uncomfortable people became with my restraint. They were used to my reassurance, my quiet competence, my willingness to absorb uncertainty. Without it, conversations lingered, decisions took longer, follow-up questions increased. Still, no one asked me directly what had changed. It was easier to assume I was having an off period than to question the structure that had relied on my invisibility. Silence, when chosen, has a different weight. It forces others to confront the absence of what they'd been taking for granted. And often they don't recognize the source. They just feel the gap. I documented everything during this time, not emotionally, methodically, requests made, decisions deferred, outcomes delayed. I wasn't collecting ammunition, I was creating a map. The more I stepped back, the clearer that map became. I saw where authority sat and where accountability didn't. I saw who was praised for clarity that they hadn't created. I saw how often I'd been the quiet buffer between intention and execution. And I saw something else too. No one rushed to replace what I'd withdrawn. They assumed I'd return to form. That assumption was my leverage. By staying calm, by remaining professional, I gave no one a reason to confront me. No opening to frame me as difficult or disengaged. I was still meeting expectations, just not exceeding them in ways that benefited others more than myself. Silence became a mirror. It reflected the structure, exactly as it was. And the longer I held it, the more clearly others were revealed. Not in malice, but in habit. I wasn't being underestimated anymore. I was being misunderstood. And that misunderstanding bought me time. While everyone was busy interpreting my quiet as withdrawal, I was doing the most focused work of my career. Not publicly, not performatively, quietly. I had learned something important by then. People watch behavior, not intention. And because my behavior looked unchanged, calm, compliant, unthreatening, no one thought to look closer. That was their mistake. I began by tracing dependencies, not just formal ones listed in org charts, but real ones, the kind that live in calendars, inboxes, and habits. Who asked me questions before making decisions? Who relied on my judgment without looping me into the credit? Which processes stalled when I wasn't nudging them forward? I already knew much of this instinctively. Now I made it explicit. My notebook became more than a record. It became a system map. I documented workflows end to end, not because I was planning to leave, but because I wanted to understand how deeply my judgment was embedded in outcomes others assumed were automatic, where discretion lived, where interpretation mattered, where things worked not because of policy, but because I knew how to translate between people who didn't. I paid attention to language, to how requests were framed, to what urgency was communicated, to those who had the authority to decide and who simply absorbed the consequences. What struck me most was how little redundancy existed around my role. Not officially. On paper, there were backups. In reality, those backups came to me when things got complicated. I didn't hoard information. I organized it. I made sure everything I handled could be understood, audited, and, if needed, transferred. Not as an act of generosity, but as an act of self-respect. Knowledge that lives only in your head keeps you trapped. Knowledge that's structured gives you options. At the same time, I stopped rescuing unclear decisions. When instructions were ambiguous, I asked for confirmation. When timelines conflicted, I flagged them early instead of fixing them quietly. When assumptions were wrong, I documented the correction instead of absorbing the cost. None of this was confrontational. It was professional, but it changed the texture of things. Meetings became more precise when I was present. Emails became more careful. People realized, without ever articulating it, that my silence no longer meant consent. Still, they didn't notice the preparation. They didn't see me strengthening my external network, reconnecting with former colleagues, taking quiet calls during lunch, learning how my skill set translated outside the narrow frame I'd been placed in. They didn't see me reviewing contracts, policies, escalation paths, understanding not just what I did, but what I was accountable for and what I wasn't. Most importantly, they didn't see me detach emotionally, not in a cold way, in a clear way. I stopped needing validation from people who benefited from my invisibility. I stopped interpreting politeness as loyalty. I stopped confusing familiarity with alignment. That detachment freed up an enormous amount of energy. Instead of asking, why are they doing this? I asked, what does this structure reward? Instead of asking, how can I be seen? I asked, what happens if I'm not? The answers were instructive. I began positioning myself, not above anyone, not against anyone, but alongside systems rather than personalities. I aligned my work with formal authority instead of informal expectation. I made sure my contributions were visible where they mattered and contained where they didn't. People still smiled in meetings, still used collaborative language, still assumed I was there to support. They had no idea that the version of me they'd grown comfortable with was already gone. What remained was quieter, more precise, less generous with unreciprocated effort. And because there was no drama, no disruption, no emotional signal to react to, they stayed relaxed. They thought nothing was happening. That's the thing about preparation done properly. It doesn't announce itself. By the time anyone realized the ground had shifted, the map was already complete. The reveal didn't come as a shock. It came as confirmation. By the time I saw it clearly, I had already sensed it for weeks. An imbalance so obvious once named that it was almost embarrassing no one had noticed it earlier, including me. It happened late one evening, after most people had logged off. I was reviewing a sequence of decisions tied to a long-running initiative, one that crossed departments, vendors, and leadership oversight. On the surface, it looked robust, well-documented, approved at multiple levels. In practice, it hinged on a single thing, my judgment. Not my title, not my authority, my discretion. I was the one translating vague executive intent into operational reality, the one resolving contradictions between departments that didn't speak directly, the one quietly choosing which interpretation of a policy made sense in context and which didn't. None of that was written down, not because anyone was hiding it, but because it had evolved that way, over time, through trust, through habit, through my willingness to absorb uncertainty so others didn't have to. I traced the chain carefully. If I stepped away from certain decisions, if I stopped interpreting, stopped smoothing, stopped compensating, things wouldn't collapse. That was important. This wasn't about fragility, but they would slow down, and in slowing, they would become visible. Delays would require explanations. Explanations would expose assumptions. Assumptions would lead back to the places where my invisible labor had once filled the gap. That was the leverage. Not destructive, not punitive, structural. I sat with that realization longer than I expected. There was no thrill in it, no sense of triumph, just a steady, grounding clarity. For years, I had thought leverage came from position or personality, from being louder, sharper, and more aggressive. What I saw now was different. Leverage comes from understanding where value is quietly created and who absorbs the cost of making things look effortless. I didn't rush to act. That would have betrayed the point. Instead, I reviewed my documentation with new eyes, not as a personal archive, but as a mirror of organizational reality. I saw where accountability had been blurred, where expectations had drifted, where my role had expanded without formal recognition or protection. I also saw where my boundaries had been too soft. That was on me. The reveal wasn't about what others had done wrong. It was about what I had allowed by confusing helpfulness with obligation. Once I saw that, everything recalibrated. I stopped feeling defensive. I stopped needing to justify my restraint. I stopped worrying about how my choices might be perceived by people who hadn't questioned the benefit of my silence. I wasn't planning an exit, not yet. I wasn't planning a confrontation, not at all. I was planning alignment between effort and authority, between responsibility and recognition, between who I was and how I moved through the system. And alignment, I realized, sometimes requires withdrawal before re-engagement. I closed my notebook that night and didn't write anything new. There was nothing left to capture. I had what I needed. The next step wasn't about exposure. It wasn't about forcing anyone to admit anything. It wasn't even about change in the traditional sense. It was about choice. Once you see leverage clearly, you don't need to use it aggressively. You just need to stop pretending you don't have it. That knowledge alone changes how you stand in a room, how you answer questions, how you decide what to carry, and what to let fall where it naturally will. I went to sleep that night calmer than I'd felt in months. Not because things were resolved, but because for the first time I knew exactly where I stood. Once you understand where leverage lives, you reach a quiet crossroads. It's not dramatic. There's no countdown, no ultimatum, just a narrowing of possibilities until only a few paths remain. And you know instinctively that whichever one you choose will close the others permanently. I gave myself time at that point. Not because I was unsure, but because I wanted to be precise. I listed the options honestly. I could speak up, formally, carefully, name the imbalance, ask for recognition, request a clearer role. That path was familiar. It appealed to the part of me that still believed clarity automatically produced fairness. But I also understood the risk. Speaking up would require others to admit something they hadn't experienced as intentional. It would trigger defensiveness, reframing, and selective memory. Best case, I'd be labeled assertive. Worst case, difficult. Either way, the structure would remain largely intact. I could stay as I was, continue performing the role I'd been assigned, just with better boundaries. Do good work, keep my head down, accept the trade-off. There was comfort in that option. Stability, predictability, but it came with a cost I was no longer willing to pay. Self-erasure. The third option was the quietest and the most final. I could step fully into alignment with my actual value, even if that meant disrupting the equilibrium others relied on. Not by force, by withdrawal, by choosing not to compensate for gaps that weren't mine to fill. That option didn't involve threats or announcements. It involved consent, specifically the removal of it. I sat with that realization for days. The question wasn't, what do I want them to see? It was, who do I want to be when this is over? I didn't want vindication. I didn't want apologies. I didn't even want recognition from people who had benefited from not giving it. I wanted coherence. I wanted my effort to match my authority. My responsibility is to match my voice. My presence is to be intentional, not assumed. Once I framed it that way, the decision became obvious. I chose the irreversible option. Irreversible doesn't mean dramatic. It means you stop doing things you can't unsee. You stop returning to versions of yourself that no longer fit. I didn't announce the decision. I didn't document it. I simply began acting in accordance with it. I declined a request that fell outside my scope and redirected it appropriately. I asked for formal ownership before taking on responsibility. I let a timeline slip that I would once have quietly saved. Nothing collapsed, but nothing smoothed itself over either. That was the point. The system began encountering itself. People noticed friction without knowing where it came from. Meetings ended without resolution. Follow-ups multiplied. Questions circled without landing. Still, no one confronted me. The discomfort was diffuse, hard to assign, easy to rationalize. I remained calm throughout, polite, consistent. There was no emotional signal to latch onto, no conflict to point at, just a subtle but undeniable shift in how things moved. Inside, I felt steady, not empowered, grounded. Choosing the irreversible path didn't feel like leaving. It felt like arriving at a version of myself that no longer negotiated her own boundaries for the sake of harmony. I knew there would be consequences. I just didn't know when they'd surface, or how visible they'd be. But I also knew this. Once you stop compensating for dysfunction, you can't be blamed for what it reveals. And I was finally willing to let things be revealed. Once the decision was made, the rest became procedural. That might sound cold, but it's the truth. There was no emotional charge behind what came next. No sense of urgency, just a series of quiet, deliberate steps taken in the right order. I reviewed my role formally, line by line. My job description, my contract, the language around scope, authority, and accountability. I noted what I was responsible for and, just as importantly, what I wasn't. There was a gap, a significant one. Much of what I'd been doing lived in that gap. Not out of obligation, but out of habit. So I began closing it. I aligned my actions strictly with documented responsibility. When asked to make judgment calls outside that boundary, I requested written confirmation. When expectations drifted, I redirected them back to the formal owners. This wasn't defensive, it was clean. At the same time, I took care of things people didn't associate with conflict at all. I reviewed compensation benchmarks, updated my resume, not because I was planning to leave immediately, but because clarity requires options. I spoke discreetly with a mentor outside the organization, not to complain, but to calibrate. Every move was reversible, except one. I stopped making myself indispensable in ways that weren't acknowledged. That change was subtle enough to go unnoticed at first. People assumed I was being efficient, focused, maybe even proactive about workload management. No one connected it to a deeper shift because nothing had happened that required interpretation. That's the advantage of moving in silence. You don't trigger alarms. You don't invite narratives. I continued documenting outcomes, not just delays or friction, but responses. Who stepped in when I stepped back? Who hesitated? Who escalated? The absence of my intervention revealed more than my presence ever had. What surprised me was how quickly uncertainty traveled upward. Small questions that had once been resolved quietly now required meetings. Meetings required alignment. Alignment requires authority. And authority, exposed, has weight. Still, no one looked at me. I wasn't defiant. I wasn't withdrawn. I was exactly as responsive as my role required, and no more. Behind the scenes, I made one additional move, a protective one. I ensured that everything I had built, every process, every system, was documented in a way that was accurate but neutral. No editorializing, no commentary, just clarity. If someone else took it over tomorrow, they could follow it, but they'd also see exactly where decisions required judgment, where context mattered, where experience couldn't be automated. That documentation wasn't a threat, it was a boundary. And boundaries, when set quietly, change dynamics without announcing themselves. Days passed, then weeks. People adjusted to the friction instead of addressing it. That told me everything I needed to know. They weren't ready to ask why things felt heavier. They were still hoping it was temporary. I let them hope. Moving in silence isn't about hiding. It's about not explaining yourself to people who haven't asked and wouldn't hear the answer anyway. By the time the consequences began to surface, my position was already clear. I wasn't waiting for permission. I was waiting for reality to catch up. The first consequences didn't look like consequences. They looked confused. A project that usually moved smoothly stalled for reasons no one could quite articulate. A decision looped back for clarification that would once have been handled in a single exchange. A meeting ended with more questions than answers. Individually, these moments were insignificant. Collectively, they created a sense of drag. People started saying things like, "This feels harder than it should be," or "We're missing something," without being able to name what that something was. They weren't missing a tool or a resource. They were missing an unspoken function, me. But because I was still present, still responding, still attending, still polite, the absence wasn't obvious. It was diffuse, hard to trace. No one could point to a moment where things broke. They just slowed. I watched the organization experience itself without my silent corrections. Not with satisfaction, with curiosity. It was revealing to see how quickly uncertainty escalated when it no longer had a quiet place to land. Questions that once stopped at my desk now traveled upward. And upward they became heavier. Managers asked for updates more frequently. Leaders requested alignment sessions. Decisions that had once been made confidently were deferred. And still, no one connected the shift to me. Why would they? I hadn't changed, as far as they could see. The colleague who had often taken the lead began to feel the pressure first. Their presentations grew more cautious. They asked more questions in meetings. They started looping me in, publicly this time. "Lucy, does that align with what you're seeing?" It was a subtle shift, not an apology, no recognition, just an instinctive reach towards stability. I answered carefully, factually, without filling in gaps that weren't named. "Yes, that's consistent with the current process," I said once. Or, "That would require clarification from compliance." No more, no less. They looked slightly unsettled each time. Not offended, just unsure. Others began doing the same, asking for my confirmation, seeking reassurance. The system was trying to re-anchor itself, but anchoring requires acknowledgement, and no one had offered that yet. The discomfort spread quietly, not as blame, but as fatigue. People worked harder to achieve outcomes that had once felt effortless. They stayed later. They scheduled more calls. And in those moments, something interesting happened. I was no longer invisible, not because I was being praised, but because my absence from the margins was being felt. Still, no one confronted me. That would have required naming the dynamic, and naming it would have required admitting how much had rested on someone they hadn't fully seen. It's easier to feel the loss than to trace its source. I remained steady throughout, not defensive, not smug, just present. There's a particular power in not reacting when others begin to feel the consequences of a system you once held together. Not power over them, power over yourself. I didn't explain. I didn't volunteer insight. I let the process speak. By the end of that phase, people were tired, not burnt out, confused. The kind of confusion that comes from realizing something you relied on wasn't guaranteed. The consequences had begun. They just didn't know where they were leading yet. The shift from confusion to panic was subtle, but unmistakable. It began when leadership started asking the same questions more than once. Not for clarity, for reassurance. When answers didn't land cleanly, when follow-ups multiplied instead of being resolved, a quiet urgency entered the room. People sensed that something fundamental had changed, even if they couldn't articulate what it was. Meetings became longer, more people were invited, decisions were revisited, language softened. Less certainty, more hedging. The organization was trying to correct itself without knowing what it had lost. That's when the first attempt to fix things appeared. A senior manager asked to meet with me privately. The tone was warm, casual, concerned. "We've noticed some friction lately," they said. "Just wanted to check in, make sure everything's okay." It wasn't an accusation. It was a reach. I told the truth, but not the whole story. "I'm doing well," I said, "just focusing on what's within my scope." They nodded, relieved. The conversation moved on. They hadn't been looking for insight. They'd been looking for reassurance. What they didn't understand was that reassurance was no longer mine to give. Soon after, responsibilities that had once been implicitly mine were redistributed. Hastily, awkwardly. New owners were named without full context. Expectations were set without understanding the nuance they carried. The result wasn't failure, it was inefficiency. Processes technically moved forward, but without coherence. Decisions were made, then revised. Solutions were implemented, then quietly undone. People started referencing how Lucy used to handle it, not to me, to each other. That's when regret entered the picture. Not personal regret, but systemic. The organization was realizing too late that it had relied on something it hadn't protected. Someone asked if I could help get things back on track. Not officially, not publicly. In a side conversation, framed as collaboration. I listened, I nodded. Then I asked a simple question. Who owns the final decision? There was a pause. They named someone who wasn't me. Then they should decide, I said. It wasn't defiance, it was alignment. That moment closed the door. After that, the tone shifted again. Less warmth, more urgency. Meetings became more formal. Emails are more careful. People started documenting things that had once lived in conversation. They were trying to rebuild the structure on the fly. But a structure built in panic is rigid. It doesn't breathe. It doesn't adapt. And it certainly doesn't replace judgment. By then, it was clear. Whatever had been lost couldn't simply be restored by asking nicely. Not because I was withholding, but because the conditions that had allowed my quiet contribution no longer existed. Trust had been replaced by caution, assumption by process, informality by escalation. The organization had changed its own texture, and I had changed with it. There was a moment, brief, human, when I felt something like sadness. Not for myself, but for what might have been possible if awareness had come earlier. But sadness isn't a reason to reverse alignment. By the time people realized that something essential had shifted, the system had already adapted around the absence. Poorly, perhaps, but adaptation had begun. And once adaptation begins, reversal is almost impossible. They weren't facing my resistance. They were facing the consequences of a structure that had depended on invisibility and lost it. The confrontation, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. It happened in a small meeting room with the blinds half open, late in the afternoon. No agenda, no HR present. Just two people sitting across from each other, both aware that something had shifted and neither pretending otherwise. The colleague, the one who had smiled in meetings, who had carried my ideas forward as if they were communal property, looked tired, not guilty, not defensive, just worn down by a system that was no longer cushioning their confidence. I wanted to talk, they said. Things feel different lately. I nodded. I didn't fill the silence. They continued. You've always been such a steady presence, and recently it feels like you've pulled back. That word again. Pulled back. As if I'd been extending myself beyond reason all along, which in a way I had. I've been focusing on my defined responsibilities, I said calmly. They frowned slightly. But you used to help connect things, smooth things out. I still do, I replied, when it's within my role. There it was, the boundary, spoken plainly. They shifted in their seat. I guess I didn't realize how much we relied on that. I looked at them then, not sharply, just directly. That reliance was never discussed, I said, or acknowledged. There was no accusation in my voice, just a statement of fact. They were quiet for a moment, then carefully. If we'd known, maybe we could have handled things differently. Maybe, but maybe lives in the past. I didn't hide anything, I said. I just stopped compensating. That was the closest I came to confrontation. They exhaled slowly, as if something had finally been named. Not blame, reality. I never meant to take credit for your work, they said. It sounded true, or at least sincerely believed. I know, I replied, and I did know. That's what made this situation harder to explain to others. There was no villain, just patterns. Intent doesn't erase impact. The conversation didn't resolve anything. It didn't need to. There were no apologies offered and none requested, just an understanding, belated, incomplete, that the dynamic they'd been comfortable with had ended. Before we stood to leave, they asked one last question. Is there any way we can go back to how things were? I considered it, not for effect, for honesty. No, I said, but there's a way forward. It just looks different. They nodded, not in agreement, in acceptance. That was it. No raised voices, no emotional release, no dramatic closure. The confrontation wasn't about settling scores. It was about confirming what had already become true. I walked out of that room lighter, not because I'd won, but because I hadn't compromised myself to preserve a dynamic that no longer fit. Quiet dominance doesn't announce itself. It just refuses to return to silence. Who I am now is not the opposite of who I was before. That's important. I didn't become colder, or sharper, or more guarded. I didn't lose my capacity for cooperation or empathy. I didn't start seeing everyone as a threat. What changed was the relationship between my values and my behavior. Before, I believed professionalism meant absorbing discomfort so others didn't have to feel it. That being easy to work with required me to be endlessly flexible. That if I stayed patient long enough, clarity and fairness would arrive on their own. Now I understand that professionalism also means definition. That clarity without boundaries is just exposure. That fairness requires structure, not hope. I still work carefully. I still listen. I still speak without raising my voice. But I no longer confuse silence with virtue. I choose when to be generous. I choose when to step in and when not to. I choose visibility where responsibility exists and restraint where it doesn't. That choice has changed how people interact with me. They're more specific now, more prepared, less casual about assuming my involvement. When they ask for my input, they name it. When decisions are made, ownership is clearer. Not because I demanded it, because I stopped erasing myself. There's no bitterness in that, just alignment. I no longer take pride in being indispensable. Indispensability is a vulnerability disguised as loyalty. I take pride in being coherent, in knowing that if I contribute, it's intentional and acknowledged. The environment around me has changed too. Some people adapted, others drifted away. A few became distant, not hostile, just less comfortable without the old dynamic. That's okay. Relationships built on unspoken extraction don't survive boundaries. They weren't designed to. What I've gained instead is something quieter and more durable: self-trust. I trust my judgment enough not to over-explain it. I trust my work enough not to overperform it. I trust my values enough to let systems reveal themselves rather than forcing outcomes. And I trust that walking away from invisibility doesn't require drama. If there's one misconception I want to correct, it's this. Choosing yourself doesn't mean choosing against others. It means choosing not to disappear for their convenience. I didn't burn bridges. I didn't seek revenge. I didn't humiliate anyone. I simply stopped being the silent infrastructure holding up a structure that refused to see me. And in doing so, I became visible to myself. That more than anything changed how I move through the world. There's a version of this story that could have ended louder. It could have included accusations, public reckonings, a moment where everything was finally said and everyone knew exactly who was right and who was wrong. But that version wouldn't have been honest, because the most difficult workplace betrayals don't come from enemies. They come from environments that benefit from your silence while praising your character. From people who smile in meetings and never question where the value they present actually came from. For a long time, I believed trust meant endurance. That loyalty meant staying quiet. That integrity required me to absorb more than I was asked to carry. What I learned instead is simpler and harder. Trust without boundaries isn't trust. Loyalty without reciprocity is extraction. And silence, when it protects everyone but you, is not professionalism. This story isn't about punishing anyone. It's about refusing to disappear. Quiet dominance doesn't look like winning. It looks like clarity, like stepping out of roles you never agreed to play, like letting systems experience the weight of what they once took for granted. Nothing miraculous happened. No one suddenly apologized or changed overnight. There was no dramatic redemption. What happened was more realistic and more lasting. I changed my alignment, the system responded, and I stayed intact. If you're listening to this and thinking, this feels familiar, I want you to know something. Noticing the pattern doesn't mean you're bitter or ungrateful. It means you're aware. You don't owe anyone endless access to your effort. You don't owe silence to people who benefit from it. And you don't need to raise your voice to be taken seriously. Sometimes the most powerful move is simply to stop compensating. Let the friction appear. Let the questions surface. Let responsibility find its rightful place. And then decide, calmly, and then constantly, deliberately, who you are willing to be in that reality. I didn't tell this story to offer a blueprint. Every situation is different. But I did want to offer language for an experience many people struggle to name. So I'll end with one question, and I'd genuinely like to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever realized that your silence at work was being mistaken for consent? And what did you do when you saw it clearly?